Welcome to the Unspeakable podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. I will tell you about our returning guest, Sarah Hepola, momentarily. This is an extra special, kind of extra long episode for reasons I'll explain. But first, a couple of announcements. They have to do with the Unspeakeasy, mostly anyway. So I should tell you that the retreat in Austin, Texas will be our next retreat. It's June 24th and 25th. It's over the weekend. This is a daytime only weekend retreat. So as you may know, many of the retreats are like 3 nights overnight, and we go someplace sort of remote. This one is right in Austin, near downtown, very conveniently located. And it will be during the day, probably like, I don't know, 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. It includes a barbecue cocktail reception on Saturday evening. That's all included. So you're going to get lunch both of those days, plus the party on Saturday evening. As always, space is limited and it is filling up. But if you are, a gal and you want to come to an Unspeakeasy retreat, go to theunspeakeasy.com and check out the Austin retreat. The one that we had in Minneapolis a few weeks ago was fantastic. That one was a little bit different. It was a hybrid overnight and daytime retreat, and that worked out really well. We had incredible guest speakers, incredible participants. It was intense. Minneapolis is a very interesting city when it comes to a lot of the issues we talk about around here. So, get in on this if you're not already. It's pretty spectacular. And the online community is thriving. That is available for membership at $150 a year. That's really affordable. Just think what that breaks down to every month. I think it's like $12.50. It's great. So if doing a retreat is not in the cards for you right now, the online community is amazing. Everything is off the record. It's a private community. We kind of do a screening process for everybody who enters. So it's a very secure space. Everybody is super interesting and also very respectful of everybody's privacy. And it's amazing. Like I said before, we kind of built this thing thinking that I wouldn't have to deal with it that much. And I'm actually in there all the time, like the main social media that I'm using right now. Again, theunspeakeasy.com. And also, in case anybody is confused, the Unspeakeasy, the free thinking women's intellectual space, private community, is not specifically related to the Unspeakable podcast, what you're listening to right now. The Substack for this podcast is a separate entity from the Unspeakeasy. I know there's a lot of stuff to subscribe to, and we're always trying to think of ways to bundle things, but right now they are totally separate entities. So in case there's any confusion. Okay, what else do I have to tell you? Oh, by the way, there's a meeting for founding members. This does relate to this podcast. The Substack. If you are a founding member of the Substack for this podcast, The Unspeakable, we're going to have a founding members Zoom hangout this coming Sunday, May 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. We usually hang out for about an hour and a half or so. I know it's Memorial Day weekend, but I was told that that's fine. Nobody has any plans anyway. So if you're a founding member, come on over for that. I'll send out a post for you guys on Substack to remind you. Okay, so Sarah Hepola is the returning guest. This episode is getting out a little bit late. For the first time ever, I got delayed on the podcast. I got so sick that I actually had to reschedule a bunch of interviews and I fell behind. It's never happened before. Even when I had COVID, I managed to do an interview and get the episode out, but somehow when I got back from Minneapolis, I was so sick with just what I guess was just a cold, but it was more debilitating than even when I had COVID. So I really got behind on things. So what I decided to do was to bring you this entire interview with Sarah Hepola. It includes the bonus portion as well as the main interview. So even if you are not a paying subscriber, you're going to be able to hear the whole thing. So this interview is divided basically into 2 parts. Sarah, who, as you may know, is a journalist, an essayist. She is the co-host with Nancy Rommelmann of the podcast Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em. She's been on twice before to talk about her writings and her thoughts about various culture war issues. She published a piece. It wasn't a piece, actually. It was a solo podcast episode of Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em about her recent experience teaching on the college level. She taught writing, creative writing, for the first time ever, and she did a very poignant solo cast about what that was like and her expectations of the students and the whole thing versus what actually happened, what they were reading, how they reacted to reading assignments. It was really lovely. And so I brought her on to talk about that. We talk about what was on her syllabus, authors like Maya Angelou, David Foster Wallace, James Baldwin. We talk about her students' willingness to separate the artist from the art. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about an essay that Sarah originally published a year ago on Mother's Day that she re-upped for this Mother's Day. And that is about the fact that she's not a mother and that she had always wanted to be, and what it's like to live in that space of taking a path that she hadn't anticipated taking. We talk about the nature of regret, the courage it takes to admit having regret. And it's a really great conversation that goes lots of different ways. So I encourage you to listen to the whole thing. This is a long episode, but we are coming in a few days late here, and I'm actually going to leave this up through next week. We'll take a little Memorial Day break, so you'll have more than a week to get caught up on everything, and then I'll get back on schedule unless I get terribly sick again. Okay, I'll stop talking now. This is my conversation with Sarah Hepola. Sarah Hepola, welcome back to The Unspeakable.
Meghan, I'm back. So happy to be here.
You're someone who's always on my speed dial when it comes to guests, among other things.
Oh, lucky me.
Your interviews are always popular and listeners are always requesting you. But I called you this week because of an especially compelling solo cast you recorded for your podcast, Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em. It was about the experience of teaching college students today.
Yeah.
And I refer to that subject a lot kind of in passing around here, but I don't think I've devoted an entire episode to it. So tell us why you devoted an entire episode to that subject.
Well, it was my first semester teaching in a real live American university. And I had been dabbling with the idea of teaching at colleges for a while. I mean, look, I'm a writer and a journalist by trade. Like, the overlapping Venn diagram that, that goes along with like writing books and teaching classes in colleges is what, 45%, 60%? I don't know.
I want to hear like what your expectations were. What were your fears? Because you went in and you were going to teach creative writing, and we should say these are undergraduates.
Yeah, it was going to be what we call like creative nonfiction, but with a memoir bent.
Okay,
memoir and personal essay.
I've taught this kind of class many times, and I have not taught at an actual institution for several years, and I have my theories as to why that may be, and those theories may be valid or not. But there you are. Were you kind of like loaded for bear kind of thing? Were you like ready to get resistance? How did you plan your syllabus? What was your approach?
So the months leading into starting this class, which was going to be a workshop, right? And it was going to be, I got to create it, which was the cool part, but also the challenging part. But I had sort of two-pronged fantasies. And what I mean by that is there was this one side that was like, it's going to be like the Dead Poets Society. Like they're going to be standing on their like desks, and they're going to be like, I'm going to, change their world. And then the other side was like, I'm going to get canceled on the first day. And I have to say, the other thing is like, I have not lived my life and especially curated my creative output, professional output, with the idea that 19-year-olds would be looking at it. By which I mean, there is so much what you might call inappropriate content in my Google searches. I mean, it's just, I've been cussing from the beginning. It's been about sex. It's been about too much drinking. The thing, I mean, I don't even, but like I have written a lot. In the years leading up to this decision, I wrote a lot about and talked a lot on my own pod about dating younger men. And I was like, oh, take it back. like I'm very professional. there's a picture I do a podcast with Nancy Rommelmann called Smoke 'em If You Got 'em. You've been on it. It was one of our most popular episodes. And the main picture is me smoking because I, like a dirtbag, picked up smoking during the pandemic.
Yeah, but that's into old school intellectual. All my professors smoked.
Yeah, well, I know. That was back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, now it feels like, walking around with Mein Kampf or something like that. It's just like it's right. And, yes, it has this sort of retro sizzle, and I've heard that young people are kind of picking it up again and whatever.
Yeah, totally. I see young people smoking all the time. Actually,
yeah. But it didn't feel professorial. It didn't feel like, especially because I was just starting. So it's just like, I don't know what this is going to be like. And so, I kind of went in worried that what they were going to have found on Google. And I walked into the room and realized oh, none of them has any idea who I am. Great. Wonderful.
They're not going to bother.
But they don't care. They don't care. Why would they care? I didn't care about the idea that I cared about the personal life of my professor at the age of 19. I just didn't even have the bandwidth.
Right. I know.
When you get to MFAs, then that's when people are like, oh, so-and-so and their interesting history and this is their canon of work. But at the age of 19, you signed up for a nonfiction class because you needed 3 credits. It's like,
right.
I didn't bother.
Right.
So it took them a while to figure out, oh, okay. I think people. And one day, one of the kids was like, "You're on Instagram?" And I was like, yes. And they pulled up Instagram in the class and they were like, "You have a lot of followers." And I was like, "I'm a big deal. I'm like
in their esteem.
I'm a really big deal. I don't know if you knew that."
So these are what kind of students are they? Are they sort of first generation college students? Were they English majors? Were they traditional undergraduate age? What was their sort of demographic?
Yeah, it was a total mix. It's really hard. I mean, first of all, it was half and half. It was a gender split, half and half, which was very unusual in terms of the memoir genre.
Yes.
Because if you teach personal writing and memoir, you tend to get, it's 80% female.
Right.
And so I was surprised to find this 50-50 split, particularly because colleges are trending female. But this college, because of its tech-centric focus, I don't think is. And a lot of the students, I would say about half of them were literature majors. And, pursuing that with the same vagary that I pursued an English degree and a liberal arts degree. It's kind of what are you going to do with that? Well, I don't know. We'll find out. Just sort of leaning into what they found interesting. And then about another half of them were, there was a STEM major, there was a history major, there was, all sorts of things across the board. And then what was interesting to me about it was that, oh gosh, I think there were 5 or 6. So I had 18 kids in the class. I say kids, but 2 of them were adult students in their 40s, but I'll say kids. And there were about 5 or 6 of them that were children of immigrants. So there was a really interesting diversity, which is, but there was one young woman who had moved from a country in Africa that I can't remember now, unfortunately, when she was younger. And, she told a really interesting, where she lived in Africa was very conservative. She moved into the Dallas area and she wrote an essay about the part of what it talked about was the culture shock of, the short skirts and the low tops and oh my God, all the skin, because it's the sort of casual sexualization of the female body is something that is invisible to American eyes at this point because it's been part of our life since the sexual revolution 50 years ago. But other countries don't have that so necessarily. And so, it was jarring to her. I had, a student who was the son of Taiwanese immigrants, 2 kids from Vietnam, another one from Eritrea, which is right next to Ethiopia. And they brought very interesting perspectives. The first day, I was about 15 minutes into my spiel, this is who I am, this is the class. And this student just got up and left. And I thought, well, isn't this cool? In college, you can just leave and nobody nobody has to ask for permission. It's just, we're all adults here. And then I kept going and I just kept talking and talking and talking. And 30 minutes had passed and I forgot that she was gone. And she walked back in the class and I was so startled by it that I actually said in front of all the kids, "Oh my God, I forgot you were in the class." And she didn't say anything. And she just started walking. Oh, and one of the kids said, "Row," did that like "row" noise. And I was like, please don't do that.
Oh, no.
Because it felt like it ramped up the moment.
Like cat fight is about to begin kind of sound.
Yes. And I was like, I didn't need that sound effect. And I happen to love that student, but that was a salty moment. And she just walked to her books and left. Didn't say a word.
She picked up her books and walked out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I'm going to be canceled after 15 minutes. That's it. It's the shortest college career in history. And I just said to the class, like, wow, that was awkward. And I'm just going to keep going. And just kept going. And, we had the rest of the class and it, I reached out to that student. I had been given mixed advice, like some people said, don't worry about it. That happens. Some people said, if she needs you, she'll reach out to you. Some people said she's probably dropping it. I just decided, whatever, it's going to make it easier for me to sleep at night if I just email her.
Wait, sorry, hold on a second. But you were just introducing yourself, like sharing your own background. At that moment, was there anything like that you suspected had set her off?
Man, you know how when like you're talking to a group of people, you're kind of in a fugue state?
Yes, every week, or one person on a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I didn't think how much damage could I do in 15 minutes was really the question that was going through my mind as I got home. Because later in that class, we did get crossways about, somebody asked me my favorite author and I said David Foster Wallace. And that sparked somebody else. It was actually the same kid that had said, "Wow." Oh. He said stalker. And I was like, nope. Right.
I want to get to that moment.
We'll get to that in a second
because you talk about that in the episode. But let's go back to this one student. So what had you said?
So that tense moment had not happened yet, and so I'm running the recorder back and I'm like, what did I say? I do, going into the class, I was aware of this tradition of trigger warnings, but not even sure if they used them anymore and not sure what the standard was. But I had made a spiel that I thought the genre of personal essay and memoir particularly invited stories of trauma, complication. That over the semester there was going to be a lot of stuff. It would be about abuse. It would be about, dramatic historic passages, tense relationships. So I wanted them to kind of have a blanket trigger warning that was like, if you're in this class, you're gonna be okay with that.
Right.
And if you're not okay with that, this might not be the class for you. I'm a fairly approachable person. It seemed inconceivable that I could have mortally offended someone within the first 15 minutes of a fairly, anodyne introduction. But I just didn't know. I had no measure. I had read all these articles that seemed to be focused on the short distance between a teacher saying something and a student taking offense. Mm-hmm. That it happened so quickly, and then the stakes got raised so dramatically and sort of wound their way up this ever proliferating bureaucracy.
Okay, but this student who walked out, what happened? So I
reached out to her and she said, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I was going to email you too. I was having a panic attack. When I have a panic attack, it was totally unrelated to the class. When I have a panic attack, I can't really engage." Because that was the thing that freaked me out. I said, "Are you going to leave now?" And she just didn't say anything. She just walked out. And I was like, what just happened? Mm-hmm. Oh, and I said, "Is it something I said?" And she left. So that student who, continued to have a little bit of a rough semester, but she is now graduating. And by the way, I learned enough about her life to learn that there were a lot of really good reasons. This was not a case of somebody being, I think, like unusually or alarmingly sensitive. This was somebody that was legitimately struggling with a lot of stuff in life that would be challenging for anybody. And I also want to make one blanket statement, which is that about halfway through the semester, it became clear to me that I might want to write about the kids one day. And so I asked them to close their eyes and I said, do any of you have objections? If I ever write about you, I would not share your names and I would not share personal details, but I might like to write about this one day. And none of them had objections. So I do feel comfortable talking about them because,
Yeah.
in a classroom like this, you are sharing secrets, you are taking a bit of a trust fall. And I would like, I guess, listeners who might be concerned about that to know that this was something that we had discussed.
Right. You talk in your solo cast about what was on your syllabus. You have Maya Angelou, Melissa Phoebos, David Foster Wallace. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here.
James Baldwin,
James
F. Scott
Baldwin, of course.
Fitzgerald.
Yes. Okay. So there's you span a number of literary genres and eras. What surprised you about what the students liked and didn't like, what they responded to and what they were more resistant to? Were you taken by surprise?
A few times, yeah. I mean, the first thing we read was Joan Didion's On Keeping a Notebook. And I think of it as like almost like a pop song everybody would like. It's like listening to the Beatles or
It's a
something.
nice little starter.
It's like so short, it's so easy, and it's lovely, and it has like such lovely phrasing. And I was surprised that a couple of the kids in the class were like, I hate this. And I was like, why? and I had such a mixed reaction to that because I think one of my fears going into the class was that people would have trouble expressing disinterest, disdain. The workshops.
Oh yeah, no, they don't have any trouble with that.
Oh man, I
They're
didn't
happy to
realize
tell
that.
you that they roundly disapprove of something or downright hate it.
So that's not just that I created an environment of honesty. That's a generational thing.
No, they love nothing more than to tell you that they hate something, especially if it's like just part of the literary canon. It's Michelangelo, overrated.
Okay, interesting. Well, that surprised me, and I was like, "Why don't you like her?" And this student was just like, I don't know what this lady's going on about. I can't. It's just rambly, and I was like, "Oh, it's so interesting." I mean, that's a good lesson for me in terms of something that I have dealt with in my own writing, and you've written eloquently about, which is the idea that if it's worth writing and someone loves it, someone will hate it.
Yeah.
And sometimes even at the age of 48 and 25 years into this profession, it can be hard for me to remember that everything that I write that someone loves, someone will hate.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to instill that idea in them. And so this seemed like it was, right out of the gate, we were good. That surprised me. They loved the Fitzgerald essay because we read the crack up and it was about mental illness and his depression and drinking too much. And, when that came out, it was so controversial and Hemingway, his, of course, friend and in some ways professional foe, was so, just like, this is so embarrassing. You've just like ruined yourself. And you roll the clock forward 100 years and that mode of writing is so much more popular than what Hemingway did. I'm not saying Hemingway wasn't profoundly influential and shaped most of the 20th century, literature.
Well, exactly. I mean, he shaped Joan Didion's whole aesthetic, so you can see it right there. Yeah,
very much so. But this idea of taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and not tucking it away in the pages of a fictional novel, but airing it out and saying this happened to me. That is incredibly popular, marketable, and clickable.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time. But but the students were not objecting to, sort of another white man talking about his problems with Fitzgerald.
I thought that was going to happen, and not at all. Not at all. That wasn't really a problem. I didn't get that, except with there was a little bit of that with Joan Didion. It was kind of like, who's this white lady that's complaining?
Oh.
But that was very minor. I think there wasn't a lot of racialized critique. I will say when we did Maya Angelou, this one really did surprise me. I wanted to do an excerpt from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. There isn't a personal essay. They didn't really have personal essays at the time. So it was, how do you find this in a bite size form? And so I had kind of selected 2 excerpts that I thought might work. One was a little bit like, going to the church and grown up stories. And another one was about the incident of molestation that happens that, I had just read or reread I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I was really taken aback by how well Angelou writes this passage. It was so unusual at the time. I believe she was the first, kind of high profile writer to be writing an autobiography that contained a passage like that. And it's kind of what makes the book famous and what makes her famous. And so I put this to the class. We have 2 excerpts. One of them is a little more traditional, and one is much more racy. And close your eyes. Again, I always have them close their eyes. And which one do you want to read? And there was not one student that voted for the molestation passage. Not one of them.
Okay, and yeah, because you mentioned this in the episode too.
Yeah.
Let's drill down a little bit. So you told them that they had the choice between reading 2 different Maya Angelou passages. So how many pages are we talking? Like what did they know what the subject matter was of, like, the first choice versus the sexual trauma choice?
I was pretty vague about it. It was like one is a coming of age excerpt and one of them is about, a sexual trauma.
Okay.
And I think the reason that it struck me is because if I had been in that classroom and you had said you have 2 choices, one of these is taboo and one of these is mundane, I would have been like, taboo, taboo, taboo. Like, I would have been like, I want to read the part, because I had also said, like, this is kind of what makes it famous. She was the first person writing about this. And it was very striking to me that they were like, hard pass.
All
hard,
of them, unanimously.
Every single one of them.
And when you say close their eyes, so was this a blind vote?
Yeah.
So they weren't like looking around.
Yeah, I didn't want them to be influenced by anybody else. And it was just 100% not interested in
How many students were in the class?
18.
Okay.
And, and what I took from that, or one of the things as I was reflecting on it, I was like, I went to school in the 90s, went to college in the 90s, at a time when those stories were uncommon.
Yeah.
And we live in a world, and have particularly existed in a world for the last 5 years, where those stories are everywhere.
I know. This is exactly what I was thinking. And because, they're everywhere in the literature, and they're also everywhere
on social
online.
Media.
They're just, we're swimming in it.
We're swimming in it.
It's not special.
It's like, not only is it not special, it's like, can I just get a break? Like,
right.
Can I get a break from that? Can we talk about something else? And, the other thing is that the personal essays that they were writing I didn't really know what to expect. But at that point, we were probably like 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, and the personal essays were proving, I think, more intense and more open and more, like fraught, interpersonally fraught, like with issues around sexuality. There was a little bit about sexual trauma, not a lot, but it was in there. And I think it was later after I recorded that solo cast, it was actually just last week, I had like a bit of a chit chat session with some of them on Zoom. And they were saying that they actually found some of the intensity of the personal essays to be one of the hardest things of the class.
The essays that they wrote.
That they wrote, that their classmates wrote, that they loved it, that they loved that experience, but the emotional intensity ramped up so fast. Like we hadn't really gotten to know each other yet. And so, like, if I were going to do the class all over again, I would do a little bit more of like, I'd build in like a couple weeks to get to know each other. Before we blast each other's face off with like the worst thing that ever happened to us.
I'm curious. So they didn't have a sense of wanting to learn how to write about personal issues and trauma in an artful literary way, because that would be the idea of reading Maya Angelou. It's like, look, you can write about this stuff this way, like a real writer does, or you can write about it as if you're on social media. And there's a reason that we read literature, and there's a reason that something that Maya Angelou is considered literature and Tumblr is not.
Right.
But were they like interested in making that distinction?
Well, that was sort of the animating idea of the entire class.
Yeah.
You know, was like, people are writing about themselves all the time. How do you do that with caution and care and rigor and artfulness? So, you know, I would be now guessing, but I think a lot of them would have found it more useful to figure out how to do that while talking about your growing up years.
Right.
Than talking about that particular issue.
Right. And it's hard to write about something while it's going on. Of course. Yeah. That's like one of the cardinal sins of memoirs. You got to wait till the event is sufficiently in the past.
Right. Which is why a lot of the essays were about their family life. You know, they were about tensions with parents. They were about, you know, father-son dynamics, mother-daughter dynamics. And, you know, I think also probably germane to that answer is that a lot of them, the class had not been, because it was added so late, I think, because, you know, it was sort of like oh yeah, why don't you teach a class? It was just called nonfiction writing. And so it didn't, a lot of them didn't know what they were signing up for.
Right.
And so when they found out what it was, I seriously thought half the class was going to drop it the first day. I mean, I drove home that night just sort of like with my head in my hands, like, I'm going to have 8 students, but miraculously, none of them dropped it in I don't know why. And I think many of the ones that had expressed on the first day kind of like, well, I didn't know it was going to be this, and this is a little bit weird. You know, by the end of the semester came around and were like, you know, this is not a genre. Like, I wouldn't have necessarily signed up for this class if I'd known what it was, but I'm glad I did.
Mm-hmm.
It was much more interesting than I thought it was going to be. And, you know, that was a good feeling.
Talk about this moment with David Foster Wallace. Now, his name does not come up a lot these days. He was on the tips of everybody's tongues constantly in the 90s. He obviously celebrated, worshipped, you know, fiction writer, essayist. Infinite Jest was his tome. Did you actually read Infinite Jest, Sarah?
100% of it.
You did? Wow. Okay.
Actually, I shouldn't say 100% of it because I did skip some of the French-Canadian high drinks parts.
Okay, well, you're French-Canadian folk.
The French-Canadian separatists. Yeah, I actually love Infinite Jest and found it very easy to get through, which is strange for me because I'm like a little bit of an ADHD reader. Like I abandon books really fast. But there was something about his sort of metabolism as a writer that just worked for my mind.
Yeah.
And it was like,
that makes sense actually, because he had a manic frenzy. Well, like hypographia.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was just kind of addicted to writing, couldn't stop.
Yeah. And I feel like that book, with all its like copious footnotes and winding rabbit holes, kind of predicts hyperlinks. The way that we're going to read in the future, you know, that basically
all the footnotes.
Yeah, the footnotes are, to me, I think the footnotes are analog hyperlinks.
Interesting. Yeah, good point.
And so, you know, he's basically trying to portray the way that the modern mind works, but he doesn't have the infrastructure for it. So it's this, you know, overwhelming, non-linear reading experience that can be very frustrating to people, but it's starting to predict the way that our minds are going to work, which is that like you or I could be reading. This happens to me all the time. I'm reading a very good story, but there's a hyperlink in it. I click on that hyperlink, I go down that rabbit hole, and then I come back.
I know. See, I loved David Foster Wallace a lot, and I especially liked his nonfiction. I know that's kind of like a basic thing to say, but as an essayist, he was he was just so influential. But my feeling about the footnotes, it was like he couldn't make a decision. So much of writing and creative work is about choosing. You choose what you're going to say, but mostly you choose what you're not going to say. And it's like he wouldn't omit anything. He wasn't able to just say, okay, I'm not going to go down that path. I'm not going to say that. So he would like load up all these footnotes. And I know that in and of itself creates an artistic product. Like that is the creativity. But I don't know. I was always a little bit just like, dude, pick a lane. Like,
No,
that's
I think
called
that's
being a
totally
grown up.
fair. I think that's totally fair. And, it just so happens that I liked it,
Yeah.
that it worked for me. And, I think that book is something like 1,100 pages. And I know his editor, suggested cutting 400. And it was mostly the French separatist sections, the French Canadian separatist sections. And he was like, okay, thanks for your advice. No.
Yeah.
He was like, I'll take out 2 words. Like, he was just unbelievably
he could
stubborn,
get away with that.
unbelievably
Yeah.
preening, So there's a lot of reasons to hate David Foster Wallace. But I also think I would not want those, and this is what happens so often in today's discourse, is like, there's all these reasons to hate someone, but that doesn't mean there's not a reason to love them.
Yeah.
And to love them deeply. And, so I had said,
well, what did you assign for starters?
So actually I didn't assign him. Well, he came up because they had asked me my favorite book or who my favorite writer was. This was a question I had asked of them. We went around the room and they told their favorite books. And by the way, it was it was all like sci-fi. It was all stuff I didn't know. And you'll be interested in this too. I asked them, what are the memoirs that you know? And so I was like, has anybody heard of Eat, Pray, Love? No, no, nothing. Has anybody heard of Wild? No, nothing. Angela's Ashes, 2 hands. Educated, 3 hands.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what about Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey? They were like, well, we've heard of Matthew McConaughey. It was, I think of memoir as such a populist genre, but they're not operating in buying books by going to Barnes and Noble.
Well, they're not the quote unquote book
by the
buyers.
way, nobody goes to Barnes and Noble, but they know the books that are assigned to them. And so when I said, do you know Night by Elie Wiesel? They were like, oh, yes, we know that.
Because that was assigned in high school.
But they had books that I thought had kind of entered into the common language, particularly because they became movies. But the movies are so old at this point.
I mean, those are, but these are like white lady book buyer kinds of books.
Yes. And then Wild is 10 years old.
Oh, at least. Oh, the movie. Yes. Yeah. The book more so. Yeah.
And it's like, so they're 19. They were 9 years old.
Right.
By the way, I was teaching students that weren't born when 9/11 happened.
I know. Yeah. Get used to it. Yeah.
Blew my mind.
Yeah. Soon you'll be having car mechanics and doctors and surgeons who were not born.
Yeah. It's wild.
Before 9/11.
So, somebody had asked who, they said, we've answered this question. Now because a lot of them were like, oh, I don't know. This is hard. And I was like, got to do it. So they were like, okay, what's yours? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And then I said, well, one of my favorites is David Foster Wallace. And then one of my students said, Stalker. And I was like, okay.
So let's break that down.
We're going to stop right here. And, this was something that I was concerned about not because I think it's happening particularly in colleges. I think it's because it's happening around us in common discourse all the time.
But where had they, because let's understand, they were referring, I'm assuming, to Mary Karr, who had, she was a poet, writer, very successful memoirist, had written about her relationship with David Foster Wallace. Had they read Mary Karr, and that's where they were getting this?
It's important to know that the student that said this was in his 40s. It was one of my older students, because the rest of the students had never heard of David Foster Wallace. Yeah,
because I would actually frankly be impressed if a 19-year-old said Stalker, David Foster Wallace.
They didn't even know who he was.
Right.
They were interested in this debate that was about to take place. I mean, everybody was sort of like, oh, what's happening? Who's the stalker? What's happening?
Mm-hmm.
David Wallace's relationship with Mary Karr was written about. She wrote about it in her memoir, Lit, where she didn't name him, but sort of had all these, he wore a bandana and
I can't remember. What was her name? Did she have a name for him? There was some kind of
Michael
moniker
or something.
I think she had some kind of.
I think she called him Dave, actually.
Oh, okay, maybe.
I think she called him Dave, and then, but it just, nobody ever thinks
they
of
had
David.
A tumultuous relationship. I mean, they deserved each other in a lot of ways.
It is clear that person in that memoir has anger issues. There's a point where he throws a table across the room.
Yes.
But I think things got a lot more complicated when Wallace killed himself and then had exited the conversation and was sort of sainted in the media
Right.
and the subject of a very high-profile biography by D.T. Max called Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. When it came out a little bit before the Me Too era, but I remember on Twitter, Mary Karr, again, who is a very popular memoir writer in her own right. I mean, she wrote The Liars Club, she wrote Cherry. All of her books become bestsellers. She is arguably a better selling writer than Wallace. And she said, I told DT Max about Wallace's history of violence and being a stalker, and he never put it in the book. And, I find this whole thing really fascinating because actually, I mean, I would be a little bit more sympathetic with this if Mary Karr hadn't written her own memoir.
Mm.
I mean, you wrote a 500-page memoir. So why didn't you put it in the book?
She did not put that in the book. So it's not like she had said her piece. I think
she made the point that like she had kind of downplayed it while he was still alive, but now that he was dead and they were going to be doing this kind of thorough reckoning with his legacy, why was, she wanted this to come out now. And, there's an interesting conversation. I have never seen DT Max, who is a respected biographer. And I love, by the way, I love that book. Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. I found it beautiful, but I don't know the truth of Wallace's life. I never knew the guy. So why did he not include this? Did he not include this because, when you're doing a piece of journalism, you have to have like 2 or 3 people corroborate it, and he couldn't find the corroborators? Did he think that it would steal? I don't know. I'd just be guessing. But it became, especially because this sort of, now this is 2016, 2017, you drop this little pebble into Twitter and you watch it become headline clickbait everywhere. And so I don't know what my student had read, but it wasn't surprising to me that his sort of like somehow in the echoes of social media and, kind of doom and gloom, let's get him, especially let's get the sort of literary darlings of an earlier age world that we lived in, that somehow his one word description of Wallace was stalker.
And who was this guy? Like, was he a reader? Like, where would he, is this just like a guy who's just following social media like anybody else? So that is
my guess. Yeah. I mean, there's not
kind of rose to the surface of his awareness.
Kind of a punk dude, like, lived in New York in his 20s, is now going back to college in his 40s. I mean, wore cool clothes and had cool glasses. I mean,
so when he said stalker, okay. So the moment that sort of drops like a lead balloon, and does anybody else say anything? What did you say in that moment?
No, I immediately stopped him. I just said, hey, I'm going to just go ahead and take this moment to say, I don't know if Wallace is a stalker or not. There's certainly an argument that he is. We can talk about that, and we can have really interesting conversations about what portion of people's questionable behavior should be brought in to evaluate their literary output and their legacy. But what we're not going to do is reduce people to one word, labels.
Mm-hmm.
This class is about expanding your understanding of them, not contracting.
And what did he say?
Fair enough. He didn't argue.
Okay.
I think my tone, he was being a little bit like side eye under the breath, and I brought the hammer down.
Well, he was also showing off that he knew something about David Foster Wallace. He was showing off to you.
Maybe.
And, these kids, this is something that he knows that they don't.
Maybe so. I don't know. But I do know that particular, we were going to be reading a lot of people that you could hang out to dry if you wanted to. It's my personal opinion that you can do that with pretty much anybody.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and so
did so then how did these students, were they interested? Like, I mean, I'm curious, like, there's so much discussion around this, and There's a book out now called Monsters by Claire Dederer that's about this very thing. Like, do we separate the artist from the art?
Mm-hmm.
It's a timeless question. How willing were the students to engage with that question?
The only other time I can remember it coming up is that I had them listen to the Rick Rubin podcast on Barry Weiss's Honestly podcast.
And Rick Rubin is a famous music producer, we should say.
He's a music producer, but he had put out a book on creativity that I found so kind of like fully stirring, like inspirational and beautiful. And I thought that we needed a little bit of a break. I just liked the idea of making this an assignment. They loved it. It was one of the things, the most universally loved thing we read all semester. But there is a point where Barry asks Rubin, what do you think about basically people getting canceled for certain ideas, dangerous ideas?
Mm-hmm.
And Rubin, whose career started in the rap world, it's expanded quite dramatically, but some of the early artists he worked with included the Beastie Boys and then people like the Ghetto Boys who were doing, kind of horror gangster rap. And he's like, I can't remember exactly what he says, but it's somewhere around the idea that there are bad people but no bad ideas kind of thing. I hope that's not a misrepresentation, but it's close enough. And there were two students in the class that fought back very hard against that. I mean, both of them, and I really was proud of my class because they would do this a lot. They'd say like, I love this and I love that. Like they weren't making, like total dismissals of things. Even when they didn't like something, they would fight, like this is what I like about it. But then they would say, but I really strongly disagree with this idea. And I could feel the energy change in the room. Like there were just a couple of moments, I would say like 5 or 6 moments in the entire semester where a culture war issue entered the classroom and it was like you could feel the energy shift. And one of them was actually Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss's name.
Were you reading something that she wrote, or did her name just come up?
Because the Rick Rubin podcast was on the Barry Weiss.
Oh, did you have them listen to it?
Yes.
Oh,
I had them listen to it.
Okay,
no, so none of them except for one student knew who she was. And so when it came his turn, he said, well, I really don't like Barry Weiss. And I was like, well, okay, I'm just going to stop. I should have just let it go. I'm learning. But I stopped him and I was like, well, tell me why. And he was like, oh, this, that, and the other thing.
What did he say, actually? Because this is always a great test. They can never actually come up with anything.
Because she wants to cancel the woke mob and she is always, she's canceled Palestinian speakers at Columbia. I was like,
19 years old.
I said when she was 19. And he was like, oh, I didn't know it was that long ago. I just read it on Wikipedia. And I was like, well, I hope that none of you have to face the experience of watching your life's work be crowdsourced on Wikipedia one day, because I know so many people that have Wikipedia entries that it's just like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. Too bad. You don't get to fact check your own Wikipedia page. And people that tend to make them tend to be people that are super fans or that are super not fans.
Yeah.
And so, it was this was a really interesting moment, or I would say it's like the 3rd or 4th week. One of the kids said to me, I said something about technology and he was like, you sound like Joe Rogan. And everybody kind of laughed, because there was just this awareness that like sounding like Joe Rogan was a bad thing. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. And it kind of became a running joke between me and that student. It was fine. But later I said something else about technology. And this other student goes, you sound like Ted Kaczynski. And I was like, I go, what?
Which one? And which would you prefer?
What?
You'd be like, thank God that you've,
oh my God.
The Joe Rogan reputation has been
lifted from me. So I can now level up to this. And I turned I must have turned like evil eyes on her because she just like her whole and I said, what? And she said, the Unabomber. And I was like, no, I know who Ted Kaczynski is. I'm wondering how you know Ted Kaczynski. And I'm wondering what on earth I said that would have made you think that about me. And she kind of got like, I don't know. It's just something, I don't know. I shouldn't have said it. She's a very sweet student, but she had blurted something out and then wanted to take it back. I could feel. And somebody else in the room said, Kaczynski had this manifesto that was about kind of all about
he
like
kind of
against
had
technology.
a David Foster Wallace vibe to him, Ted
Did he?
Kaczynski. I think this could easily be construed as a huge compliment.
She was a very
there was a
smart
maximalist writer. I bet Ted Kaczynski had a lot of footnotes. I bet.
You know what? She's a very, very smart student, and she was probably right. I probably did sound like Ted Kaczynski, but I said to her, and I said to the class, listen, we're not going to do this thing where we characterize, like I was trying to make a genuine point about technology.
Yeah.
And I felt like what she said just cut me off at the knees. And I was trying to do that thing of creating a classroom where people feel comfortable, but not bringing in stuff that's like, oh, I'm going to just cut you off at the knees with this. And, later she and I had an interesting conversation on email. She felt bad that she had said it. I explained my objection to it. She agreed that it was, entirely not what she meant to say. That I think she was trying to be funny, like, because somebody had said Joe Rogan earlier. So it's like, oh, this will be funny too. And it wasn't to me. And I think I had a hypersensitivity probably that I was going to be perceived as, I don't even know what, like out of touch or something.
Well, exactly. Old. I mean, the problem with both of those references is that they're quite dated. So yeah, I'm impressed that she even knew who Ted Kaczynski was or that he wrote anything. I mean, it's not like this is taught in the classroom.
I was really impressed with my students. I mean, this was this is not the like prestige college in Dallas, but I came to be very impressed both by their intellectual curiosity and their depth, their warmth. I mean, I really loved my students, and we've talked a lot about, some of the moments that were like trigger moments for me, to use an overused verb. But I think I want to express how deeply I cared about them and how profoundly attached I felt to them by the end of the semester. I mean, by the time everyone had sort of walked out on the plank of the personal essay and shared about their lives, and you end up feeling very close with each other. And it was like, oh, I don't want to leave now. Like I want to keep teaching. Like, let's do this again next semester.
Well, what? Yeah. I mean, did you have conversations just about the censorious nature of the culture in which they find themselves? Did you talk about sensitivity readers? Did you get a sense of how they actually feel about what's going on?
No, because it was not, they're 19 and 20.
But they read, those are YA books. I mean, that whole world is
they've grown up inside it.
Right.
But I'm operating from a world where it used to be a different way. And now I'm negotiating this new way. And is it good? Is it bad? Is it better? Is it worse? But they don't have that comparative. And it didn't seem to me like some of the conversations about technology were getting into censoriousness, and by the way, I mean, like I think at some point in the semester they would have Googled me, and probably might have found the story I wrote for The Atlantic about the things I'm afraid to write about, or, but these were not things I brought up in class.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I have to say, anytime the culture wars stuff came into the classroom, it felt like it tilted us off the axis.
Yeah.
It got people into their own camps in ways that it felt like all the other literature that we were reading, in part because it wasn't from our era, our very era right now, most of it. As we got later in the semester, it was. But then the early part, they're reading James Baldwin, Notes from a Native Son, and it's like, nobody thought that was politically fraught, even though it was incendiary at the time.
Right. See, I think that this is very encouraging because these are undergraduates. I feel like this generation is more open-minded and frankly sick of what's been going on in a way that maybe graduate students are less likely to be. I think things may be starting to shift. This is kind of a way of rebelling, right? To not care about the sensitivity reading conversation as much.
Well, one of the dynamics that became clear to me in the class was that, these are Zoomers, these are Gen Zers for the most part. But there were, in addition to two 40-something students, I also had two millennials, two 30-somethings. And I actually just thought they were 19 at the time. But I learned later they were older students. And there was an interesting dynamic that developed where a lot of dismissive things were said about millennials. And then the two millennial
Oh.
students would kind of like, jokingly bristle or silently say,
Like what kinds of things?
I'm trying to remember. It was like, well, we were reading something and I don't want to say what it was because I kind of don't want to say what it was, but it had some cuss words and that were very salty. There was a way of talking, and one of the students said, "It's just so millennial."
Oh, like that kind of vernacular,
Like a very
Yeah.
thrusty, in your face.
Well, that's I can write for the internet. That came out of I'm not writing for the printed page. I'm writing for the internet, and I can say fuck over and over again, and it makes me sound extra political. Yeah, if you insert fucking in front of anything, it makes you sound edgy and transgressive, and therefore it's some kind of political statement. It's just so lazy in my view. But
it is lazy, and it's not great writing, but it also was very endemic to the time.
Right.
And so this was something that had been published, I think probably around 2011 or 12. And so it definitely had that imprint. And she said like, oh, I just found it kind of trite, like very millennial. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, like
and
that's
I was
like we talked about the boomers.
Yeah. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she was like, I don't know. It just reminds me of like, stay, what did she say? Like, stay calm and eat a cupcake or something like that. Like the whole design.
Yes.
What is it?
Well, there was the keep calm and carry on, art posters that were everywhere. I don't remember the cupcake one. But.
Well, there were like a million different versions of keep calm and do your yoga, keep calm and drink a Red Bull or whatever the fuck. Yeah. I don't know what it was.
Right.
I don't know. But it was just sort of like, this aesthetic of kind of like yoga and cupcakes. And I thought, oh, wow, that's I didn't realize that these younger Zoomers would have, of course they would, like a rebellious disdain that mostly comes from having older siblings. That like you don't necessarily want to be like, or you have to differentiate yourself from. But we didn't get into a lot of those conversations. I will say I couldn't tell if it was because we were in Dallas, which is not a coastal city, in case you don't know your geography, but is also on balance a more conservative city. I will say that there was like a blanket, like, oh, Trump's an idiot. None of us like religion. Like there, like it had very college-y, kind of presumptions. But we did have a conversation about Melissa Phoebos's essay on consent. And that was a really interesting one because they loved the essay for the most part. And I should say for the most part, because I don't know, maybe some of them didn't, but I don't even remember people saying anything bad about it. But they said they wanted to talk about the subject. They wanted to they just want to talk about consent. They just want to talk about consent. And the conversation I thought was very interesting. And I had a male student, like one of the young women was saying, this just reminds me all the ways that you have to constrain your body as a woman and you can't do this and you can't do that. And then one of the male students said, I know that's historically been the way it is, but I feel like that's shifting. And I feel like that burden is on men. And, that's the kind of thing that like you could get roasted on the internet for saying it, but it's so true.
Yeah, that piece. So you're referring to Melissa's piece about consenting. I can't remember the name of it. Consenting to touch. I
spent my life consenting to touch I didn't want.
Right. And it's from her book, Body Work.
It's from Body Work. Okay, I thought it was from Girlhood.
Oh, you know what? Correction. That may be true. Body Work is a craft book, which talks about similar issues. I think you're right. Yeah, it's from Girlhood. Anyway, she's a gorgeous writer.
Gorgeous.
And God, that piece was so interesting to me too, not to get derailed, but like, it made me spending your life consenting to, touch that you never, or, enduring touch that you never consented to, that has so many forms. Like I remember, and I'm sure this is not what she meant, but I do think it's relevant. I remember being like in elementary school and there was this thing where if you had long hair and there was a girl behind you, she would start just spontaneously braiding your hair. Did you experience this?
Totally. Well, I never got to have long hair, but I saw it.
I hated this. And it was like this weird culture of girls touching each other and touching their
Girl
hair
stroking.
and kind of petting their hair. And I never had sisters, and I didn't have like a very, that kind of like close physical relationship with my mother. It just wasn't part of my sensory world. And I hated it. And I felt so violated. And I never felt like I could turn around to the girl and be like, stop it.
Yeah, of course.
And that kind of thing goes on a lot in all sorts of ways. It's not just sexual.
Well, it was, and that became clear in the conversation, because some of the things that we talked about were like, one young woman talked about a colleague hugging her at work and always hugged her, and it just really bothered her, and she didn't know how to say anything about it. Another student told a story about someone, this one kind of blew my mind. She said that somebody had put out his hand to shake hands, and she found it so aggressive.
Oh, really?
And I was like, oh, wow. We're dealing with several things here. One is shifting gender roles, shifting notions of comfort. But the other one is the pandemic thing that brought about, on one extreme level, a sort of isolation and germophobia or xenophobia. And I'm not xenophobia, agoraphobia. And that's not this student at all. But on a much lesser degree, a kind of questioning of what touch was even safe. And I don't mean sexually safe. I mean safe, like shaking hands was a way of doing business. It was the polite way. It was
it's also a class signifier. It's a social signifier, because the whole air kissing on the cheek is a class signifier.
That's right. And I brought up the fact that, in France, they kiss you on each cheek, and they were like, oh my God, and actually, like when I go to Europe, I've seen every once in a while, I'll see people kiss on the lips. And I'm like, what is happening? What is happening? I'm not comfortable with that at all. I have my own zones of comfort, but I happen to be a hugger. And I don't want to say startles me, because that's too strong, but it surprises me when students that I know to be warm and lovely, and there's nothing in them that's sort of telegraphing, stay away from me, in other words, express how uncomfortable they are made by that kind of touch.
I know.
And I didn't know how to deal with it.
No, I feel like this warrants an entire episode, because the hugging thing, it's more noticeable now because people aren't doing the cheek kiss thing. I mean, the cheek kiss thing is not just European. That's like New York literary circles. That was always going on, right? You would go to a cocktail party and you'd be kissing everybody on the cheek, and it would be awkward, and you would miss, and sometimes you hit somebody on the lips. I mean, it's just awful.
I once did that with my mom, and I kissed her on the lips, and I've never forgotten it.
It happens.
Oh God, I mean, I kissed my mom. Oh God.
Well, yeah, but I mean, at least it's your mom. I mean, it's like, it's such an awkward negotiation. And it's like, if you don't do it, then you look kind of rubish or awkward. And yeah, the hug thing so I'm happy that the air kiss thing has kind of fallen away with the pandemic, but now we're left with the hug. And I find myself like, if I don't go to do it, I feel sometimes like the person is insulted. But then if I do it.
So this is the problem with the breakdown of social custom.
Yes.
Because what it means to you is not what it means to me. And therefore, there is no social signifier. This has been going on in dating for so long, because, just to use an example, whether or not a woman offers to pay for the date, the custom was always that men pay.
Oh, yeah. She reaches for her wallet, and he goes,
She reaches for her wallet, and he goes, no. And that was just the custom. But that started to shift as women started to be like, well, I should pay for this too, because I want a partner. I want an equal, like, I want equality in the boardroom. So why don't I ask for equality on this date? And I would hear these different things of like guys saying, oh, when she tries to pay for a date, it means she's not interested. And then other men would
Oh.
say, no, when she tries to pay for a date, it means she is interested. So you basically have the same signifier meaning two opposite things. And this is happening
Right.
all over our culture, where our social customs, we are so polyglot. We are so in between kind of, we don't have a culture that's shaped by religion. We don't have common experiences so much anymore. We're split into tribes. And so there is not a shared language of connection. And for people like me that kind of thrive on connection, that is something that it gives me a small measure of stress.
Yes.
To wonder, how do I express to this person that I feel close to them, that this is a meaningful interaction, but not like it's tough. And to my student's point, I think men feel this a lot. Do I look? Do I not look?
Yeah.
Do I touch? Do I not touch? How much looking is flirtation? How much looking is aggression? I do think that in some ways the burden of anxiety has shifted onto them. And I'm not saying it's shifted off of women. I'm just saying men feel it in a newly pressing way. I think this is a problem. It's one of the many things that I feel like it's one of those micro movements away from each other.
I know. Oh, there's so much to say about this. I used to touch people a lot more. I'm not a touchy person, but I used to sort of like, I would touch somebody on the knee, or like I would make a point, like I would lean forward. I would, kind of just like, there would be a sort of intimacy of body language within the context of a conversation that I'm mindful of not doing anymore.
Yeah, me too.
And it's a loss.
I'm a touch junkie. I would have been the one behind you braiding your hair if I'd known how to braid hair.
I would have slapped you across the face.
Well, now that we're friends, it would have been fine and I would have laughed. But, actually who I was the one with the curly hair that my mom kept really short because she thought that was cute. No, it wasn't. And I wanted long hair so bad. And I loved the girls with the corn silk hair. It was just like a little walking doll.
I think that's my hair. Maybe that's what it was.
Because
my hair was just very soft. It was like
freaking gorgeous.
Well, not gorgeous because it was so fine, but it was very soft. Yeah. Oh yeah, I had people would come. There was a guy in college in my dorm who used to come and just be like, "Can I just touch your hair?" See, this happens to white girls too. Can I touch your hair?
Can I touch your hair?
And it was just because it was just bizarrely soft. And I never thought of it wasn't sexual or creepy or anything. It was just like a weird, like, sure, I'm going to charge you $1, but
the awkwardness of being in a human body feels like it's getting, we have this weird open culture where everything's okay and every choice is fine and no choice is better than the other. And at the same time, we're kind of retracting from each other. And to have these two things at once, these new social taboos. I mean, it was very interesting to me that in talking about Melissa Febos's essay, which was, which talks openly about her being a sex worker, there was no snickering. There was no laughing or disdain. It was like, oh, she worked as a dominatrix. That's sure. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
None of that. But then you have these new taboos where it's sort of like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, like.
Right.
And so I was figuring out where those were. And also, I forgot where I was going with that. But the point is, it's very difficult to balance the openness of our culture with the unspoken and ever-shifting protocols of a changing world.
Yeah, no, that's the paradox. You're right. I think you put that beautifully. Well, we're going to move on to the bonus in a minute, but I want to make sure to ask you, you were teaching personal essay, you're teaching writing, they're writing things. Was there any discussion about publishing? Did any of them want to be published authors? How do you handle the fact that you are essentially teaching them something that one cannot even begin to make a living from anymore?
Right. I mean, I wanted to make that very much a part of this semester. I had been lecturing and interacting with people that had gone to colleges and MFA programs where they graduated without really sort of any sense of the market. And having only been in the market, I found that atrocious, like absolutely unforgivable, that you would take someone's money and not teach them at all how to use that skill. And so one of the early lessons that became a sort of drumbeat throughout the semester was that writing can always be a part of your life, that it's free, that it's always available to you. It can be a private pleasure. It can be, something that you try to do professionally, but I would not recommend it as a career path. And I also felt like if somebody is like ballsy enough to want that anyway, good for them. Push against it. Prove me wrong. But I found it intellectually dishonest to come into a class that I was teaching in part because I felt like the entire financial structure that I had been standing on was crumbling, and then encourage kids to go stand on it and jump on it.
Well, isn't it that it's ironic, isn't it? All the people who can't, make it as working writers anymore bail ourselves out by going and teaching other people to do this thing that we can't do. So, and that's why we ended up there.
And it had struck me over the years that it was something of a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah,
that we were making more MFA students to teach more MFA students because they couldn't get,
well,
jobs.
This is what Lee Stein will talk about. She talks about how MFA programs are a multi-level marketing scheme, which I
remember that. And I never got an MFA, but I mean, I wanted to at one point. And somebody basically told me, like, just go to YouTube, like, just watch some YouTube
just
videos.
Right. You were already doing a job and publishing work that people would kill to do in the MFA program.
But the thing is, I wanted something else. I wanted a writing community, and I wanted deadlines because I wanted to try my hand at fiction, and I couldn't seem to make myself do it. And so okay, how do you do that? You go join an MFA program. It's what most people do is they can't write on their own. So give me deadlines, give me a grade. And it appealed to me, but I was quickly dissuaded from this by many people, including many people who'd done MFAs. And, I thought that it would be malpractice, honestly, like professional malpractice, not to be honest with them about the landscape. And during the semester that we were working together, ChatGPT came out. So of course that was another wrench. I mean, as if things hadn't been destabilized enough already by everything else, then it's suddenly like, oh, AI is going to do this in the future. And, what are the jobs even going to be? And I do believe that there will be a huge opportunity for people that have the warmth of a human voice, because things will be automated. Things will sound like they were written by computer until the ChatGPT 10 or whatever
for like the next few
super
months,
good. And like, I'm just sit back and go like, this is better than.
Yeah. How do people know that this conversation right now isn't completely AI?
I mean, it probably is. I mean, essentially it is, in the sense that we're part of the art. I don't even know. But there will, I think, at least for a little while, there will be a tremendous hunger for things that have the intimacy of one-on-one connection, whether through writing, podcasting, kind of immersive exhibits, just things that bring us back to each other, because we're going to start hungering for each other in ways that we can't name, as we become more and more isolated. And so I do think there's opportunities there. And yes, there were students that wanted to write books. There were students that wanted to write memoirs. I was not going to disavow them of that. I was just going to disavow them of the idea that A, it would be easy, or B, it would be lucrative, or C, it would be a viable career path. And by the way, you played a great role in this too, because Meghan came in and talked to my class, and one of the things she was excellent on.
I was trying to leave that part out, but yeah.
Well, you were fantastic, because you broke down for them basically like, if you get $200,000 for a book, which if you did, that's a huge boon.
I said 100,000 because I'm bad at math. Yeah, it's just easier to do
you said
the math.
100. Okay,
right,
sorry.
but yes, exactly. But exactly, like you start off asking them, do you think that a $100,000 book advance sounds like something you'd be excited about?
Oh, yes.
And they say, of course.
And then you break it down. And it just basically, it's like holding a rock that just crumbles in their hand, so that they're just holding a pebble by the end.
Yeah.
And, it was, I think, a necessary disillusioning. There used to be I think when I was coming up, especially in art classes, the mantra was like, dream big. You don't have to just be a teacher or, a bank teller. You can be an artist. You can be a writer. You could do this. And over the years, I've been asked to come give these speeches to young children, not young children, but like teenage kids, tell them like they don't have to just be doctors and they can be writers. And I'm sort of like, they know that.
Yeah.
And they don't need to hear that from me. They don't need to hear dream big because they've been hearing that for a long time.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of like the post 60s.
Yes.
That just became
just 50
the
years
assumption.
Of it.
Right.
And the dream got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's like, what I need you to do is you can keep dreaming, but I need you to have like a little reality in there.
Dream smart. It should be dream smart.
Dream big and dream smart. Like dream big, but pay your rent.
We're going to move now into part 2 of this conversation. Normally, this would be the bonus content for paying subscribers, but I'm happy to make it available to everyone this week. So enjoy. Okay, we're going to do some bonus content. Thank you for sticking around on this Saturday morning.
I'm excited.
Yeah, so thought we would revisit a piece that you re-upped for Mother's Day. This was actually a piece that you first published last year called On Not Being a Mother. It's just an absolutely gorgeous and profound and deeply intelligent original piece. So I don't know, let's just jump into it. Why did you write it? Why did you re-up it? How do you feel about it a year later?
I wrote it at a period of time when I was writing really fast. I don't know how essays come for you, but I tend to have sort of wet and dry seasons. And I was in a wet season. And so I was just writing a lot. And we had just started the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast. And so I was still sort of like, am I going to do essays? Is it going to be podcasts? Like, what is it going to be? And one morning I woke up and this essay just sort of tumbled out. I have all sorts of different experiences with essays. Some of them are tortured. Some of them are super fast. This was a super fast one. And that usually means that they've been cooking for a long time inside of me.
Yeah.
And I will also say that I have been working on a second memoir for the better part of like 4 years. And it's sort of had a shifting axis. And where it's sort of settled eventually is this one. It's the focus of the book, which is, takes place during my 40s when I am single, thought that I might have children and decided not to, was chasing various men. And so it had different foci at different times, but we kind
foci.
Foci.
Is that the plural of focuses?
Out. Yeah. Listen to me go.
You own that. All right.
Yeah. Solo cast. That's just what I say now when I want to be fancy. Solo cast.
Yeah.
But I think this is the heart of the book that I wanted to write. And I think this essay, without my even knowing it, announced that before I was even ready to listen to it. I was still back in the weeds with like, well, can it be about love addiction? Is it about guys? Is it about dating? And it was like this essay popped out and was like, no, actually, this is the thing that you have to share uniquely. Because I think with every story I write, whether it's an essay or a book, the question you're asking is, what can I share that hasn't been told yet? And some topics are easier than others. And the topic of Mother's Day, which was, here's this holiday that the last few years I had experienced it. It was almost like a grief day because so many of my friends' mothers had died. And whatever complicated feelings I had about not being a mother, which I never really experienced Mother's Day as like anything other than like obligation, like got to do something for my mom. I was starting to realize that I would never be a mother. And that was a heavy knowledge. At least I would never be a mother in the traditional way of having a child in my body because I had closed the door on IVF and art. What's it called? Art.
Oh, assisted reproductive technology.
I just love that the acronym is ART.
Yeah, exactly.
I was realizing that, and at the same time, I had friends who had miscarriages or they were trying to get pregnant, and they, it just seemed like this holiday that was meant to kind of celebrate women was kind of universally dragging everyone down.
Which was
Anywhere.
invented by a woman who never had children, by the way.
Is
the
it?
inventor of Mother's Day. Yes. She her
Who is
name
she?
was I will look it up. I think it's Jarvis. Yeah, she never had kids and she regretted inventing Mother's Day.
Oh.
Yes, her name is Anna Jarvis. And
What year is it invented?
she founded Mother's Day following her mother's death in 1905. She conceived it as a way of honoring sacrifices mothers made for their children. And the idea was that, children would send cards to their mothers and kind of thing. But, she was one of 13 kids, only 4 of whom lived to adulthood. I'm reading this off of the internet right now.
Yeah,
I don't have this information at my fingertips.
Yeah.
But she never had children herself. And she ended up hating the holiday and thinking it was the dumbest thing ever. So anyway, it's my little footnote there.
Well, that's a potted history of my experience as well. Like, is other than losing my mother, it's just sort of like, well, this is a good idea. No, it's terrible. And I think I'd had an interaction at a massage. I'd taken a friend of mine to get a massage. Her birthday's in May. And I'd gotten a massage. And when I left, the guy said, "Happy Mother's Day." And I just was like, ah. And it's not like that hadn't happened to me before. It was fraught for me in multiple ways because I was dealing with my weight at the time. I have been up and down on the scale all my life. And around that time, I had put on some weight. And I was like, basically, I thought it was an awareness that my body had changed, and that he had looked at my body and he had decided it was a mother's body.
Oh my God, it's amazing the way we interpret things. That. Yeah.
Wow. I am like ground speed, lightning fast by taking something that's innocuous and making it an arrow that points directly into my own heart. Like, can I do that? Like, watch me run. And So I went downstairs and I told my friend who also doesn't have children, and I was like, "You told me Happy Mother's Day," and she was like, "Don't make this about your weight." And I was like, I am going to," and it was like all. It's those moments. I remember this right after sobriety, when I first quit drinking, which was like 12 years ago at this point, or 13 years ago. People would ask me questions like, "How are you doing?" And I would be like, "Stop fucking interrogating me." Like when, again, we're talking about the breakdown of social customs. When something that is expressed as innocuous at worst, and at best, kind of well-intentioned and lovely, and it's received as like, who gave me this poison dart? And I was interested in that. I was interested in exploring it for myself. I think my podcast with Nancy had just started, and we had only recently done an episode on my abortion that I had at the age of 30, which was a story I had never told publicly. And probably more than anything, that was pressing me on to write this story, because talking about the abortion I had at 30, which I did because Roe v. Wade had gone back to the States. It had been overturned in the state where I live, which is Texas.
Oh, right. And you came on, actually, remember, to talk about it at that time, because we talked about what it was like to be in Texas with,
That's right. You and I talked about it. Yes, yes. So I did a podcast with Nancy, and then I also went on your show for a separate reason, and we talked about it. And maybe they might be in different orders. I can't remember. But I was talking about it for the first time, in part because I knew it was going to be part of this new book. I wanted to kind of get my training wheels on. And it was the moment, right? Like, there was this cultural flashpoint, which was that Roe v. Wade was being walked back. And the decision that I made 18 years ago, I would not necessarily have been able to make. Now, I actually don't know how driven would I have been anyway. Would I have gotten the pill? Would I have gone to another state? I can't say. But that had been a very huge sliding door moment in my life, and it wouldn't be so easy to slide that door in the future. And so it was an interesting moment to reflect on that. Also, because when I got that abortion, I had been coming out of a long-term relationship. It was breakup sex. Great. Perfect.
You're always most fertile during breakup sex.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Like ready to pop as soon as, yeah. And I got pregnant, and I wanted to keep the child and get back together. And my boyfriend said, we're not getting back together. And so I made what I considered to be the more rational decision, which was to end that pregnancy with the idea that in the future, I would be doing it the right way, quote unquote, the right way.
Right.
And, 18 years down the road with a lot of near misses and potholes and interesting choices and triumphs and failures, it was kind of like, well, this is what you got, kid. So, and I think I've always been interested. I certainly have been inspired by your example. And I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you. I actually, and I know you don't like compliments, but you're going to have to take a few of them.
Okay. It's in the bonus, so it's okay.
It's okay.
Ahead.
It's okay. And we've talked about this before, but you wrote a story called The Difference Maker, which I still consider one of the best essays I ever read on the subject of not having children. It opened a channel in me that I didn't even know had scar tissue around it. Because I was, at the time, finishing up my first memoir. I was so focused on the sort of drinking, sobriety, young, reckless youth thing. But I was 40. I was 40 and I didn't even really think about it that much, because here's the other thing about not having kids. You don't have the little yardstick of time growing up alongside you to remind you that you're getting older.
Right.
Which is how I end up teaching a college class of 18-year-olds and being like, holy crap, all of you guys were born after 9/11.
Yeah.
Because age becomes something that's a little bit invisible to you as you get older. So when I read that story, it was like, whoa, I have thought these. I still remember the email I sent to you because we didn't know each other super well at the time. And I said, I have had these thoughts. I have, it had that beautiful thing that I think personal essay can do, which is to feel as though you are reading your own kind of chaotic, inarticulated thoughts in an elegant stream articulated by somebody else that you've never met. And it has that serendipitous feeling of like, yes, that's it. That's how I felt. Now, a difference between us, and that story had a little bit more ambivalence in it because you were married at the time. Your husband wanted a child.
Well, I mean, it was a struggle. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I have struggled with since, but it was an acute struggle within the context of the marriage, yes.
Yeah, and within the context of that essay. And so, as we have both gotten older, it's clear that you are very comfortable being without children. It's a better path for you. I am not uncomfortable with it, but I am far more ambivalent. And I live with a lot more weight in my heart of what would that have been like? What did I miss? What lessons did I not learn? What are the ways in which I didn't grow up? And what are the things that I could give to somebody else that I don't get to give? Which is why I think we didn't talk about this in the earlier part, but I also think that's one of the reasons why teaching called to me.
Yes.
Was this idea that I had so much to give and maybe I should direct it away from Hinge for a while.
Oh, the dating app?
The dating app. Yeah. Yeah.
And, teaching, Hinge, 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah. I just mean that there was a lot of maternal energy that was going into dating young men. It was sort of like,
they don't have MILF date? I would think that there would be like a special
there really should. Honestly, there should be. There should be a special MILF Manor app where they can go, because there were so many of those young men. And I mean, I didn't match with most of them that were just like looking for an older woman, love older women, MILFs
what
wanted.
What is that about? I mean, that's a whole
it's an
other
interesting
topic,
I think, it's one of the things I explore in the book, but I mean, like one of the interesting cultural mythologies is that women are invisible after they turn 40.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of reasons why that happened. One of them is a culture where fertility is much more in demand.
Well, but that's an evolutionary adaptation. I mean, it would make sense. I just feel, I don't know. I'm less inclined to blame that on the culture, that I'm just like, that's the biological reality.
Oh yeah, sure. But what I'm saying is that the culture changed and a lot of young men aren't interested in having kids. And we have also decoupled fertility from sex. So there's two lanes in their mind. There's, the marriageable woman, which is 1 out of 1,000. And then there's the other 999. Who are the women that you want to have interesting experiences with?
Wait, you think that because if men don't want to have kids, because fertility is not necessarily the default setting of women now, and we've taken that off the plate. And that is actually something I want to talk about, because I talked about it last week with Holly Grigg-Spall when we talked about birth control pill. It was fascinating. But are you suggesting that men now are conditioned in such a way that if they're not thinking about a mating strategy, then they're more likely to find older women appealing just because they haven't been conditioned to be repulsed by older women?
Maybe something like that.
Oh.
I mean, that's a, I guess the way that I would say it is that there is nothing inherently unattractive about women over 40. Women, I think, in the male mind, just exist in two categories, hot or not. It's not really bound by age. It's bound by basically what Facebook's origin story was, which is we're going to categorize all women into two categories, regardless of your age. And, this idea that the line is 40 feels like it's something that was created by, yes, like you're right to say there is a fertility thing, like an evolutionary fertility thing going on there. But it's also like as women preserve better, like my mom didn't dress the way my friends do in their 40s. Like my mom wore pantyhose and like a tweed suit to work and like had turtlenecks.
But that was hot back then. That was like the 80s.
I don't know that it was hot, but it was definitely fashionable.
The power suit lady with
but it was very masculine.
It was pantyhose.
It was very masculine, and it was very much like burying your sexuality. Well, my friends wear like their moms, and like they might have some thongs hanging around, and they might have some low slung tops and tight jeans. And I mean, like you look at people like Jennifer Lopez and Jennifer Aniston, these are like the hottest women in Hollywood for a lot of young men growing up today, and they're in their 50s.
Right.
So the idea that women are invisible or over 40 is just doesn't hold water for them. And one of the most interesting things to me is that when I have brought up this subject with multiple friends, the ones that push back on it the most and seem the most like, what am I trying to say? Not credulous, but incredulous.
Yes.
Well, are the women.
Yes.
Are the older women. And they kind of don't like, I don't know what it is. It's not that they don't like it or they like it or not. It disrupts their idea of how the world works. And they understood themselves to be off the table. And so this idea that they're back on the table is like, well, I don't know. It couldn't be true. And it's like, listen, if you look at porn searches, porn is an interesting topic because there's often this conversation about how porn has created a kind of uniform sexuality or look. But in fact, I mean, that may be true, but at the same time, there's also like, it has expanded the erotic palette beyond what anybody, at least this person could have imagined. I mean, look, people are hunting out squid porn and incest kink and stuff like that. But, the MILF category and the older woman category and the mature woman category and the big black woman category, these are huge on porn searches. And what it tells us is that the erotic appetite is so much more vast than Hollywood and women's magazines have suggested. And, women's magazines are run by women and gay men. And, as far as I'm concerned,
the fashion industry is run by gay men.
Yeah. And they have, they're the ones that floated out this idea that rail thin women were what men wanted. Men never, like I've talked to so many men that are like, where'd that come from? Like, not my thing. I like curves and I like a woman that looks womanly. Now, not all men, #not all men like curvy women. My point is the variety and taste. And it's just certainly true. It's certainly not true that all young men want to date older women, but it is definitely been my observation that many of them are open to it. Also because you use the word mating strategy, which is like there's this idea in evolutionary biology between long-term mating strategies and short-term mating strategies.
Right.
And on the dating apps, it's dominated by short-term mating strategy, which basically is a way of saying it's a hookup. It's a hookup culture. Whether you like it or not, you may be looking for love, but you're still thrust into this arena where short-term mating strategy is the default. And so when what you're looking for is short-term mating strategy, age in particular does not matter. The sort of will our family get along? Do we have shared values?
Mhm.
None of
Mhm.
these things are going to really come up. It's hot or not. And
Mhm.
so I do look a little bit younger than my age. At least that's what the guys tell me.
Yes, you
No,
do.
no, I do. I think in part it's because I'm small, I'm 5'2", but I'm also like I quit drinking and I just I don't know. I don't know why, but I also think it's because I don't necessarily like think of myself as 48. I might dress younger and carry myself younger in part because I don't have a child.
I was just
Uh,
gonna say, I wasn't gonna say it, but you don't have kids, and so
I
maybe
I
that's
I
makes
don't
you more
have
youthful.
kids and
That's what
and so
yes.
this,
Fountain
you
of
know,
youth here.
yeah,
Yes.
like a certain not just like the stress and the drain and all of that, but like a certain really maturing or like cresting
Yes,
into.
immaturity does look good on us, though. That's true, yes. Yeah.
Look, I wear it well. I wear it very
Yeah.
well. But
Yeah.
it is true that you and I have spoken about this before, quite frankly. Like there are stages of life that were understood to be inevitable that you and I have not entered.
Right.
And therefore, there's stuff we don't know about the world, There's a lot of other stuff we do know about the world that that women of an early era would be envious and aghast that
Yeah.
we know about them. But I don't know what it is to answer for and care for 1, 2, 3 small humans. And so that I always carry around this sort of tiny little bit of ambivalence inside of me. It doesn't feel like grief. It just sort of feels like, but it doesn't feel like joy either.
But I bet does it really not feel like grief? Because I would imagine that it would. I think that there's a stigma against
Sometimes.
admitting that. And I think it's really important. I was talking with Stella O'Malley on this podcast a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
She's an Irish psychotherapist. And she said, regret is an incredibly brave state of being. To admit that you have regret about something, I mean, that's profound and radical because we spend so much of our lives reframing things. It's a coping
Yeah,
mechanism. It's actually
it
a
is.
sign of mental well-being that you're able to
Yeah.
reframe. Like, I went to the wrong college. Okay, I can reframe that. I made the choices that I made at the time based on great, based on
Saying
stupid
elsewhere.
TV
I mean,
shows that I was watching.
you could
Right.
hardly
Yes.
like not get pulled in by that tractor beam.
I did the best I could with the tools that I had. So that it's easier to say that than to say flat out, yeah, I regret it. I went to the wrong college. I should not have done that. I would not do that over again. And this is something that I have to live with the consequences. Now, look, going to Vassar is hardly a tragedy. And I know this sounds obscene and I'm going to be careful about this. It's an excellent school and, et cetera, et cetera. But and that's just one example of many. I find that the older I'm sort of in a period these days where I'm regretting a lot of things. Like I'm actually saying out loud to myself that I regret a number of decisions that I've made. And I've noticed that it's a very different mode than what I've been in most of my life, which is like, okay, well, that is what it is. It is what it is.
Yeah.
Move on. And I don't know which is better. I think the regret spiral, it doesn't feel good. Let's just put it that way. I may be overblowing it.
It makes
also.
other people uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't say it out loud
because they want to give it. They want to give it top spin.
Right.
It's not a regret. You learned this. You learned that.
Yeah, you don't want to make other people uncomfortable.
Exactly,
that's for sure.
But I agree with Stella O'Malley. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Yeah. About the power of letting yourself feel that. And I guess the reason that I said I had used the phrase carry around, I mean, I meant at all times I carry around an ambivalence.
Yeah.
At all times I do not carry around a grief.
Right. Right.
The grief spikes and it spikes at odd moments and it is real. It is like it'll be something as simple as visiting another. Like I did a story about this woman that had grown up on the ranch as a cowgirl, and she was a Black woman. You grew up in total poverty, but she learned to work the land when she was young. They call her Mama Sugar. I had written a story about her. It had been nominated for an award. I went to go visit them. They've gathered her whole brood. I mean, this is just like her kids, and her kids had kids, and her kids had kids. Those kids had kids. It was like 50 people around me. And I was like looking at the life and the tree that this one woman had made. And it was so warm and it was so beautiful. And I was sort of like, here's my story. Like
Yeah.
my life suddenly struck me as small and isolated in a way that I hadn't really understood it to be, because I'm really quite comfortable with my life. But every once in a while,
Right.
I will glance up against another way of being and recognize its richness. And that doesn't mean it would work for me, but it means that I recognize that there are other ways of life that I think could have been quite meaningful to
Yeah,
me.
two things can be true at the same time.
Exactly. And people will often very quickly say, well, you wouldn't have your writing career. And it's like, well, maybe not.
You say that like it's a negative thing.
I know, right? Exactly. Well, so that's the other thing, is that, I mean, I've been all up and down about my writing career. Sometimes I think it's the most important thing in my life. Sometimes I think it was, what the fuck was I doing? And,
Yeah.
so I learned a phrase. Ada Calhoun wrote a book called Why We're Not Sleeping. Do you remember that book?
I didn't read it, but I've heard really good things about it.
It's really good. It's really good. And she had a whole chapter on women that don't have children. And there was a therapist or a doctor, I can't remember, that used the phrase ambiguous loss.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it very useful. There's a loss in my life that I cannot measure. And I cannot compare the life that I would have had if I'd had a child on my own. That child would be 18, by the way. It is not lost on me that my child would have been the age of my college students, And that was something I never shared with them. But it hit me one night and I just burst into tears because I could feel like, oh, that's part of why I needed this, And I hadn't even, I was just sort of like an animal moving toward an instinct without really knowing, like, oh, that's what's happening. Because I talk about like certain people that are predisposed to be mothering and stuff like that. Like I am like 100% groomed to mother. Like I had a very soft mother that was, soft and stroking. And I had, she went back to school and sort of disappeared in my girlhood. And that was kind of one of the small little tiny tragedies of my suburban life. But all I did when I was growing up, I babysat, I nannied, I worked at daycare in college, I became a high school teacher. So my only skill set until I became a writer was to take care of children. And it was just always, I had all these friends like in college that would be like, I'm not going to have children. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then they all had children and then I didn't. And it was such a weird flip-flop where I was the only one that seemed so convinced that I was going to do this. And then I was the only one that didn't. And I think I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what happened. Is it one of these things where I said I wanted something, but I didn't really, or what I needed was different from what I wanted, or what I wanted changed? And of course, it's a combination of all these things. Any life is a combination of choice and chance and circumstance and culture, and all these things and vectors that are moving around you. In another life, I would not be a single writer. If I lived in the 1890s, I can guarantee you I wouldn't be like proudly child free. Like I'd probably be dead by now because I'm 48
Sometimes
years
I
old.
think I would be a nun.
You might have been, because you would have been a great candidate for the nun.
Oh my God, everybody says this.
Because you are so
you make
smart.
A great nun. But oh my God, what is that even saying?
Because you're just so... You're like, I always think of the nuns as being like the really smart, really like they're sort of like the Jesuits,
Yeah, I would have wanted to be like like an intellectual nun. I would have wanted to be like the Susan Sontag of nuns.
You would have been the Susan Sontag of nuns. Please, I'm going to call you that from now on. And
I would have wanted a boyfriend, though. What are we going to do about that? That's the problem, though.
Look, I would have wanted a boyfriend too, and I probably would have married to some 70-year-old man that had the right, because he would take my dowry. So I would also be like, I want to date the hot guy, but whatever. I'd be washing clothes on a washboard and doing the lie. I don't even know. I'm not even smart enough about 1890s to understand what women did back then. It was just a lot of work. And, it's so shaped by your circumstances, and you have these choices, but how much choice do you really get in the end?
Right.
I have so many friends that wanted to have kids. Not so many, but I definitely have a few. And then something happens, they lose their husband, they can't have children.
Yeah.
And so the life that you set out to create for yourself pivots at some point and it becomes the life that you have.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think of this conversation that's coming up. A lot of younger women in their late 20s, early 30s, are really revisiting second wave feminism and are very critical of it. This is
Yeah.
something that comes up in my podcast with Sarah Hepola a lot. Talk about people like Mary Harrington or Louise Perry. And I think that there's a cohort of women coming up that are young mothers, or they feel like they've been sold, they were sold a bill of goods by second wave feminists. They're very critical of the way second wave feminists assumed that men and women were the same, the way that the free to be you and me message that like you and I embrace also had an undercurrent of real non-reality.
Yeah, that's right.
in some ways. And we were, we were not told that when we were young girls that if we did want to have a family, we needed to make certain decisions and be strategic about it. That would have been considered an anti-feminist message. So what are your feelings about that discussion?
Yeah, I think it's super fascinating. I mean, I know Mary Harrington's work and I think she's super interesting. Louise Perry's book I read and I agreed with a lot of it and I didn't agree with some of it but I found it so fascinating that it came into the world. You and I have been students of feminism but also like critics of feminism. And so watching that conversation, the aperture of conversation open feels really healthy to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it also feels like a corrective. Now, I think some of this is one of the problems is, again, we get into this thing where there's just sort of like, there's so many different strains of feminism that it's almost not even the same thing. It's like, and it turns against itself. And it's like you get into this polyglot, like, what do we even all believe in?
I'm not sure what we're talking about sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if when you start saying like, well, you can be pro-life feminist, then it's like, wait a minute, but what does feminism even mean? How is this a meaningful ideology? And I'm actually personally not particularly sure that it is for me. Like, I don't really necessarily identify myself that way because I don't know what it means.
As a feminist?
Yeah, as a feminist, I'm not sure what it means to identify myself as a feminist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is that I'm telegraphing. Do you need to know that I believe in the equality of the genders? I mean, come on. Do you really need to know that at this point?
Right.
Like what it seems to telegraph is a certain, like, I'm going to be. Unfortunately, this was the outgrowth of the social media era. It was like, it seems to telegraph that I'm going to have a certain hypervigilance around the language that you use. and I don't feel that way. I feel that I owe feminism my career in many ways, the scope of my life. I don't want to turn on it and do a sort of like, this was all bullshit. But the unintended consequences, this is something we've dealt with in any school of thought, be it like marriages or democracy, like there's shape-shifting ideas that we learn as we're going. I mean, there is a really interesting cover story, and I want to say it's in Time, but I'm not sure, that basically was written, I think, in the 90s. And I don't know if it was that feminist backlash, with Ally McBeal on the cover. I can't remember which article it is, but I read it a while ago, and basically one of the women that had grown up, she was the first child, the first generation to grow up under second wave feminism, and she had gotten too old to have children. And she had said to Gloria Steinem, "Why didn't you tell us?
Yeah. Why
didn't you tell us it would be this way?" And Gloria Steinem said, "Well, we didn't know." And
did they really not know?
Well,
I mean, like,
look,
what does that mean?
Nobody knows what.
Like, they don't know that there's a biological clock?
No, of course they do, but they
didn't know the downstream consequences. I mean, you can't anticipate these things.
You cannot anticipate these things. And remember that Betty Friedan was very much invested in keeping the nuclear family together.
Right,
And one of the
right.
splits in feminism becomes when she wants to, like, let's talk about the family. Let's talk about the relationships between men and women. And you start getting the radical feminists that come in and are like, no, let's talk about family abolition. Let's talk
Yeah.
about, let's talk about lesbianism. And she's like, no, 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 no.
And I think those are the ones that we remember. That's the thing, is I think that it's easier to remember the radical feminists and Gloria Steinem. They were sexier, right? Like as media phenomenon. So
Yeah,
Betty
absolutely.
Friedan. Yeah. So exactly. Because I think that, I mean, I talk about this with Sarah Hepola a lot. Like there's a kind of, I think the memory, the residual sort of memory of the legacy of second wave feminism is like, oh, these women just thought that men and women were exactly the same and that women were going to do men's jobs and that there was absolutely no difference and that women could have casual sex and go down the list. And there was some of that, but it certainly was not all of it.
And you're also, like, not you specifically, but one is making the mistake of conflating, a heterodoxy of ideas, a sort of hydra-headed philosophy of ideas with competing theories and values as some sort of monolithic, the feminists, like there are so many people that the feminist movement itself was turned against itself in many ways. Yes. I recently watched something. Have you ever watched Town Bloody Hall? I think it's a Pennebaker documentary with Norman Mailer and
oh,
do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I don't think I've seen the whole thing, but are you talking about the debate between was it Susan? Oh no, it was Gloria Steinem and
no, it's Germaine Greer.
Germaine Greer, right? So this is sort of analogous to the famous James Baldwin, William F. Buckley debate.
Very much so. Very much so. It's Norman Mailer versus the feminists is how it had been. Had been.
You should show that to your class. And see if they have to go to the emergency room afterwards.
Just I would be fascinated with what they thought of it, just because. Listening to basically, so what happens is Norman Mailer has written a story called Prisoners of Sex. It's run in Harper's. It's been a big sensation and it's been, trumpeted up as sort of like his answer to feminism. Of course, it's actually like a pretty thoughtful piece in my opinion, but he's going to host this town hall with all these different feminists and he's, they're going to have a civil conversation. There's basically 4 different representatives on the stage. The one that we would remember is Germaine Greer. She gives the most kind of, like, she gives quite an amazing speech. She's quite good at the podium. But the woman that runs NOW, National Organization of Women, which is kind of the most staid of all the different organizations, she gets up there and proposes that housewives get paid for their work by the father and an insurance against divorce, which is a fascinating idea that essentially makes the husband the CEO of a family. I mean, it doesn't seem to, I mean, I get where they're going with this, but, and in fact, this is something that's come up again in this whole idea of like emotional labor and why don't we get paid for our work? So things come around, right? But I found it kind of mind-blowing that their idea of like the feminist reform that we need is that women need to start getting paid for staying at home. So, because that's very different than what I grew up with, which was you're not going to stay at home,
right?
That's not really even like it's an option in the sense, but like, is it really? You're going to be a woman that works. You're going to be a woman of the world.
Right. Well, if you're a serious person,
exactly,
you're going to not work at home. Yeah. No. And I mean, there's talk now of it's been sometimes phrased as reparations for women. And yeah, I've heard that concept kind of floated in the IDW space. Sometimes I think Eric Weinstein actually referred to it. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I don't think that would, that's the problem with any reparations. It's not really going to work. I don't know what the formula is, but it's definitely worth discussing. See, that's the thing, like a movement, it's a series of discussions. Like none of it is really no one thing is going to work when applied on the ground. It's just a whole kind of gestalt of thought experiments.
And, a lot of people blame feminism for things like the popularity of casual sex or even stuff around like drinking so much.
Well,
I
and
mean,
men getting off the hook sexually and
yeah,
in
and
relationships.
I think so much of that is pop culture. I mean, I was
Mm,
far more influenced by pop culture that I was watching than anything Gloria Steinem ever said. I was not really aware of feminism growing up. I was deeply aware of like teen sex roms and, all sorts of different, portrayals of a kind of blithe sexuality. That was much more influential to me than anything that was ever said at town hall between a
mm,
bunch of people that I wouldn't have even known existed. So, I think feminism gets blasted for things that feminism really had nothing to do with in some ways. At least it didn't have nearly the impact. But, because the promiscuity of the 70s and 80s comes about from the sexual revolution. And that's intersecting and working against feminism in interesting ways, right? Because the feminists were against pornography,
right.
but then by the 90s they had embraced it. I mean, so it's all
I
like
know.
all of this stuff is just you know, but it's all an experiment, right? Like
Right.
all of life. And we definitely feel that in this moment because this moment feels so fraught. I don't mean this moment between us. I mean this moment that has lasted for like what, like 5 or 6, 10 years, where it just
Mhm.
feels like, oh wow, I knew the world was changing, but I didn't know it was going to be changing in real time right in front of me. And
Yeah.
I think that has to do with this technology age, the sort of ramp up of the internet and whatever AI is going to happen next. And it's this moving history, as Tyler Cowen says, and
Mhm.
you can't get your hands around it.
Right. Right.
You can't. And so, it's how can anybody know the consequences that are going to come about from ideas that to them seemed really fair-minded, like women should be treated as full humans, women should have access to work the same as men. All of these seem very reasonable to us. We live in the spoils of the changes that were made. But there are unintended consequences of that, and one of them is that by suggesting to women that they didn't need to worry so much about child rearing, some of them worried so little that they couldn't rear children.
Right. That's very well said. So, how does that make you feel as a thinker and a cultural critic? Like we're living in this time where it's impossible to get your head around anything. Where does that leave us? Are we all just do we have to resign ourselves to sort of thinking on the page or kind of being little mental bloggers
Well,
rather than being able to step back and say, okay, this is what's happening, people.
yeah, I mean,
Mic drop.
I think for I know, I think for a while it paralyzed me. It
Mm,
paralyzed me because I wanted not only to be authoritative and to know where I was going, but to also be pleasing to the audience. And you start to get the sense that anything you say splits your audience. Half of them hate you, half of them might like
mm,
you. And it took me a while to step up to the challenge of that. And it really was just that I saw, like, if I didn't say anything, just like, I've fought so hard for this career. Am I really going to just let it wither on the vine? Because, and for me, that's when stuff around child, like, I don't have children. Like I don't have a husband. I don't have like, oh good, now I can go spend time with so and so. Because I've organized my life that I don't have any of that.
yeah, me too.
So the sacrifices that I had made to get there, I'm just gonna kind of ditch it because I'm afraid I'm getting blasted on Twitter. And for a while the answer was yeah. Yeah, I am gonna do that. And then I sort of decided that it was worth fighting for. And for me, that kind of began with writing that article in the Atlantic, which ran about a year ago. And
That was a year ago?
it was a
You're
year
What I'm
ago.
Afraid to Write About? It wasn't.
Yeah.
So how has it been? I mean, before we wrap this up, like, is it like to be a official thought criminal?
Yeah, thought criminal.
Are you, you've got the podcast, you've got your writing, and, you're certainly like not strident at all. You're not one of these people that's out there just, you know, just shooting your mouth off for the sake of the
No,
heterodoxy.
and by the way, I don't have much to say. Like
Yeah.
one of the things that has shifted in me, along with not needing to be so authoritative, is just releasing any idea of certainty. Like I
Right.
have kind of like a radical agnosticism that applies to everything, which is like been very good for me. Like I don't really know if it's good or bad. I don't really know where we're going with this. And it releases me, and it actually also feels it's the only way I can feel, I guess, as accurate as I can in the moment. And it may be lame because certainty sells and certainty feels good.
Yeah.
but it's not what I can give. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I've had a couple of run-ins over the years. Like I think one of the weird things about entering this space is that because so much of it is online, we don't really have a lot of in-person interaction anymore,
Right.
especially with people across the country. I never really know who I've shed as a friend, you know?
Oh, I know.
And you start to wonder, like, is so-and-so not getting back to me because they're mad at me?
Or am
Or
I not getting this gig
yeah,
because did I not get invited to
yeah,
this book festival
yeah,
because I
yeah.
know.
So everything starts to become suspect,
It's
but at the same
terrible.
time, it's
Ugh,
terrible.
so narcissistic is what it
Yes, it
is. It's
is.
like,
It
God, get
is.
over
But
yourself.
you can't. I can't. As my mom always tells me, Sarah, you can't be someone who cares and not cares. Like, like
Mm.
it's kind of in your DNA to care about this stuff, and so you need to tolerate that you care about it and not be too hard on yourself for it. I also don't need to make that the centerpiece of my thought and day. You know, that's a waste of time. But it does. It tugs at me. It tugs at me. I wondered what my students knew about me. Like
Mhm.
what had they seen? What did they know? I've definitely had I had a very bad interaction with an old colleague who made clear to me that he thought I was a garbage person. When I asked, and this was, by the way, all happening on Twitter. Like he was subtweeting me, and
This is a colleague, like an adult our age,
this
who's
is a
using the
fucking
term
adult.
garbage person.
This is a fucking adult. And when I emailed him offline, not offline, but you know what I'm saying, off Twitter, to say, "Hey, what's going on? Have I done something to upset you?" Which is, by the way, the second time I've done this. The first time he didn't respond. He did not respond again, and then he posted more about what a ridiculous, and he was doing this subtweeting thing that was sort of like,
Yeah.
this person that I used to know that now, has a podcast and smokes publicly and wears a bunch of stupid hats, and he was making it clear that it was me.
Mm.
Um,
Ugh.
and I will say that it hit me really hard, not because I think I'm a garbage person, but because I won't ever know what I did, what I said.
But I mean, the answer is nothing. It all has to do with him and his need to signal to his group that he's still in good
But I
standing.
had to have done something, and I think like I know there's one other person that really sort of she makes it clear to me on multiple different occasions, like how much she doesn't like me and has sort of run interference with, places that have tried to hire me and things that are not innocuous. And I've tried to reach out to her, and I know with her, she has a real problem with the way that I've talked about the intersection of alcohol and sex. I
Mm.
am sure she listened to every second of my interview on Brock Turner with you, and I'm sure she was sitting there with notes trying to wait for me to fuck up. And it is ideological for her, in addition to whatever else it might be, that I have run afoul of
Mhm.
dogma, and I am a betray. I've betrayed. Um, I've walked back, and not only that, but I get a lot of attention for it, and that galls her too. It's like, oh, you're trying to say that you're so, you know, you can't say anything. You're writing in the Atlantic. Like it's a lot of like poor little rich
You're
girl stuff.
hardly an edgelord, though, Sarah. I don't think you're exactly
I've just
out
learned
there.
that word, and it's kind of like solo cast. Like I think it's just such a cool
I know.
word.
Oh, really? It's one of
Yeah,
those.
Katie Herzog used it, and then somebody else used it, and I was like, I had to look it up on Wikipedia. What's an edgelord? And then I was like, oh, that's a cool word.
Yeah, but I know. I mean, there are those people out there, but I don't think for that. Yeah, I know. But the whole like, oh, how can you possibly be have suffered any consequences because here you are you're still talking.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
therefore, cancel culture doesn't exist. Well, most of the people who are canceled, you have no idea who they are because they've been canceled. We're talking, the real casualties of cancel culture are people who are just normal people who've
Yes,
stepped out of line at
100%.
work and their
Yes.
entire livelihoods have been lost. Their lives have been ruined. People are suicidal. People have killed themselves because of this. And it's not people like you and me. But if people like you and me don't talk, then I think we are betraying all those other people who have to stay in line.
But I feel like writing is a career that you should fight for. Like, and this was something, you gave a bit of a rousing solo cast once, that was about this. And, it was sort of this idea of like, if you're not gonna engage, what are you doing?
Right.
Like
Why did you get into the job?
why did
That's
you
my
get
feeling.
into the
Yeah.
job? Is the job about status and needing, people to believe you're a writer? Is the job about a certain cushy, elevated sense of your own importance? What is this about? And I felt like I had to get nose to nose with that and fight for it and say, yeah, you're right. If I'm going to demand the stage, I better have something to say. And I had ducked around in the corners of sort of safe play, like, I'll just write about this thing that nobody cares about. I'll just write this little ditty. And I still do that, by the way, because actually they are things that I care about. It just happens to not be the center of culture. You don't always have to be
What?
lobbing
You have
Frank.
interests
I
outside
do.
of the culture wars?
I have so many interests outside the
What's
culture
your
wars.
secret?
I
So
know.
do I, actually. I have a lot, but nobody would
I
know. Is it?
and I write for Texas Monthly and I write for Texas Highways, and these are the places that pay my bills, and I love them. And, they don't tend to be, because they're Texas magazines and we live in a very, it's a 50-50-ish state. You can't be too divisive. And so anyway, I have felt so much better about myself, though. I really feel like there has to be a moment in your life where you stop worrying about what everyone says about you and you start worrying more how you feel about yourself, and it's that earning of self-respect that kind of becomes an inoculation against the pebbles and stones that get thrown at you. So, like there's a saying in AA that's like, if you want self-esteem, do esteemable acts. In other words, it's not like we live in this therapeutic culture where it's sort of just like, oh, feel better. You're a good person. You're good. And it's sort of like people can pump you up full of that oxygen, but you'll leak out of the room right when you turn around,
Yeah.
There's nothing anybody can tell me that can, very rarely, that can override, the sort of record that's playing in my head. And so all the accolades and all of that was just sort of like not working to move the needle inside me that felt like I was doing work that mattered and that I cared about and touched people and connected to people. And that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted more than anything. And, I got into this because I had been a lonely child and I had books that made me feel less alone. And I had always said, like, it was something David Foster Wallace said many years ago, and many other writers have repeated it after him. The idea that literature's work is to make you feel less alone. And sort of like now we've emerged into this period where everybody feels alone.
Yeah.
And so your work is not your specifically work, but our work and the work of writing feels more pressing than ever. If it doesn't have to be writing, it can be a podcast. It can be a social media post, which to express yourself and the way that you feel can often give other people permission. And I'm glad that I can do that, if I can do that. And I also think I've had to build a tolerance for knowing I'm going to get it wrong. That there's a sort of perfectionist in me that wants to always fall on the right side of history, and that's a silliness. There is no right side of history.
Errand.
It's a fool's errand.
Well, Sarah, I'm so glad that you write the things that you do, and thank you, as always, for coming and talking with me. I know my listeners love it, and I love it. I could talk to you all day, but I will let you go. But until next time.
Until next time, Meghan, it's always a treat.
That was my conversation with author, journalist, podcaster Sarah Hepola. She's the author of the best-selling memoir, Blackout. She's written for places like the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Elle, Salon, Texas Monthly. She is the co-host with Nancy Rommelmann of the podcast Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em. And the Substack for that podcast is where you can find her essay about not being a mother, her Mother's Day essay that we talked about here. It originally posted a year ago, but it's up there again, and it's an incredible piece. So I highly recommend checking that out. She's working on a new memoir, which I'm sure she'll be back to talk about when the time comes. And you can find her on Twitter. You can find her on Instagram at the Sarah Hepola Experience. Her website is sarahhepola.com. You've been listening to the Unspeakable podcast. Again, if you're a founding member, you can join us for our monthly Zoom hangout this coming Sunday, May 28th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. What else? The Unspeakeasy Austin, Texas retreat is the weekend of June 24th, 25th. We're taking applications for that. Space is limited, but we do have some space. So go to theunspeakeasy.com. You can request more information. Our online community, always available and endlessly interesting and getting better every day. So again, you can go to theunspeakeasy.com. Check that out. That's it for now. I'm going to give you a week off to catch up with this long episode and anything else. So I will be back the week after Memorial Day with another super nuanced guest. So thanks for listening and see you next time.